Thank you for joining us for today's Ipsos webinar, exploring the fascinating contradictions shaping Canadian consumption habits and the opportunities for food and beverage brands to navigate a successful 2025. Throughout today's session, you will remain in listen-only mode. However, throughout the webinar, please submit your questions online using the Q&A feature. Time permitting, we'll answer questions at the end of today's session. However, if time runs short, then your question will be answered by email. I also want to encourage you to check out the handouts we've uploaded to the webinar control panel. Today's session is being recorded and will also be directly emailed to you. So now, without further ado, it is my pleasure to welcome today's speaker, Jenny Thompson, Director with Ipsos Canada's Market Strategy and Understanding Research Practice. Jenny, you have the floor.
Thank you, Ellen, and good afternoon, everyone. For those of you who are on the West Coast, good morning. It's Q4 and we are in the thick of it. And so for that, I really appreciate you spending the time with me today. It's kind of hard to believe that we're entering our second decade of sharing out this trends information. And over the past 10 years of working with this data, I can tell you there's never been a dull moment. Many of these trends, though, are more akin to tectonic shifts. They're these slow moving and evolving changes over time. And it's really when we look below the surface, that's when we can see so much change bubbling up. Oftentimes, though, we may find ourselves stuck with a bit of tunnel vision. Many of us work day to day on very specific brand and category portfolios. And so that's why it's important to just pause, take a step back and look at these broader trends and their implications as it relates to consumption and as we look towards the future. And what a time to be alive. I mean, truly, from our fast pace of life, constant connectivity, pressures of financial stress, while trying to do all the things to better our health. Did you get your 10K steps in? What about your water goals? Are you sure you're getting enough sleep? What about that protein? What did you have for breakfast this morning? Did you get those 30 grams in? Oh my gosh, you're not going to give your food those food dyes to your kid, are you? Oh, but don't be ridiculous. We just need to embrace life and just live it to the fullest. We live in a time of information overload, swirling with misinformation, disinformation, overstimulation, and consumer skepticism. And choose your next steps wisely, for we live in a highly polarized society. We're under a lot of pressure. It's no wonder that amidst all this complexity, there's a strong pull towards simplifying. We're longing for the way things used to be, and as Canadians, we're 5 points higher than the global average. Consumers are exposing this nod to both nostalgia and traditionalism, and that comfort of what once was often has great appeal when we're faced with uncertainty. But that's really only part of the puzzle. When we're talking about connecting authentically with Canadians today, it means simultaneously delivering on a multitude of complex needs. What we've noticed, though, is that this complexity often comes from this clash of multiple factors or trends coming to light, which is what you can see flashing on the screen. And at the end of the day, each side is neither right or wrong, but it unveils multi-level opportunities. Where you decide to focus, of course, really depends on best alignment, but it's this awareness and understanding of all sides that's critical. And so exposing these clashing trends is what I'm here to talk to you about today in the Consumer Clash. We have a ton of content to get through, but first I just want to ground everybody in terms of the Ipsos services that are really fueling this CHATS information. We're going to spend a bulk of the time on the macro trends, but then we'll go through some dinner and snacking highlights before we wrap up. CHATS. CHATS is our annual report of curated trend and daypart information, and it's being fueled primarily by the 5 study. Now, I hope many of you that are on the call today are familiar with what 5 is, but for those of you who aren't, 5 is a Canadian online diary of what Canadians ate and drank yesterday. You can really think of it as the 5 W's to consumption: the who, the what, the where, the when, the why. We have been in field for over a decade, since January 2013, and we've captured a very robust sample size of Canadians ages 2 and up. Now, of course, we're supplementing our data with other information from our food and beverage syndicated services, that of our FSM, our food service monitor, ACT, our alcohol consumption tracker, and then, of course, we also need to bring in some other contextual information. So for that, we're leveraging our Ipsos Essentials report. Every year we field a custom omnibus study specifically for CHATS. And then finally, we're bringing in some really rich insights from our Ipsos global trends, but we're looking at it specifically from the Canadian market. We have a lot of information to get through, as I mentioned, so let's just jump right into the trends. Many of these clashing consumption trends are really being brought to light because of these broader shifts that we see happening. So let's take, for example, our post-pandemic lifestyles. We've really adapted to balancing life at home, but we're also being pulled back to our out-of-home routines and sort of a hybrid model. Layering on top of that, the mounting cost of living pressures. On top of that, economic and social political uncertainty. And on top of that, let's call it our addiction to digital connectivity. It's honestly the perfect storm. This brings a natural allure to the past, and what we're seeing is tradition redefined. There's signals all around us from the revival of 90s nostalgia, and honestly, don't even get me started on some of the things that are coming back. But we also see trends like trad wives, the traditional wives, who give a nod to traditionalism as it relates to our rituals in the kitchen and at home. But we see clashing with this trend and retreat to old systems, this desire for modernized living. And in this context, what we're seeing is this real expansion on our taste profiles and seeking new experiences. So in terms of the broader shifts, let's just first start by acknowledging the cost of living pressures. Despite inflation leveling off and interest rates dropping, Canadians are still impacted by a multitude of factors. In fact, 80% of Canadians say, yeah, I'm impacted by more than one risk. Now, that's being primarily driven by inflation, but it also extends to other polarizing issues like climate change and politics. We have certainly demonstrated our resilience since the pandemic, but honestly, it kind of feels like the house is still on fire, and our consumption patterns aren't immune to these broader societal pressures. Perhaps most noteworthy, though, is the impact on our health and well-being. As 50% of Canadians say, these risks are moderately to highly correlated to our overall health and well-being. This, of course, has implications as it relates to how we're sourcing our foods and beverages. Despite a multi-year resuscitation in the food service industry since the pandemic, we're again reversing our trend, and that's in benefit of retail. We see presently that 84% of all foods and commercial beverages are being sourced from retail, and that's up a point compared to 2023, and we're still up compared to pre-pandemic levels. Now, our food service monitor is also mirroring this information. We do see growth in food service dollars, but that's really largely attributed to higher menu pricing as well as operational costs. In terms of traffic, we're being pulled back and we're down 1% compared to 2023. Now, when we are choosing food service, though, we're actually dining in more as we see traffic for on-premise dining up compared to last year. But what does that look like in terms of across the food service channels? We see QSR across all channels. It's the only one where we see positive momentum in terms of traffic. And I think that's really attributed to the value orientation at play there. But what we see is also these similar clashes between old and new at food service as well. We see newer novelties like A&W's Hash Brown Buddy Burger really clashing with the resurgence of some of the throwback menu items like Tim's Retro Donuts and the recent Boo Buckets at McDonald's. It's a fact that Canadians are facing rising prices on all fronts, both retail and at food service. And so we continue to track how we're adapting our behaviors in order to really mitigate these cost of living pressures. Over half of Canadians, 55%, say, yeah, I am changing my daily habits to try and mitigate this cost of living pressure. By and large, though, what we see are the top ranking changes to our behavior are really consistent with last year. We see comparing prices more often, we're cooking at home more often, and we're eating out at restaurants less. But we're also pulling back on our impulse, and we're reining in our food waste. What's really interesting, though, is the fastest growing trends. We're seeing not only cooking at home more often, but we're also planning less expensive meals, and we're changing our grocery stores. Of course, there's generational differences, and one of the most interesting things I saw was that younger generations, especially Gen Z, actually kind of buck these trends. Now, they're not totally going against the grain, but they are kind of grabbing hold of that maybe you only live once kind of mantra. Each of these obviously have varying implications on both retail and food service sides, and so it's kind of that glass half full depending on how you look at it. Now, seeing this cooking at home more often and planning less expensive meals, it really sheds light on this desire for at-home entertainment, which we tend to see weighing a bit heavier on meal occasions. So what do I mean by at-home entertainment? I mean, elevating those typical everyday meal occasions. And we're seeing growth in a desire for emotional needs, like nostalgia, for example. But of course, like all trends, when we look below the surface, there are nuanced differences. So from a format perspective, we see Gen Z leaning into these highly convenient solutions, things like meal kits and ready-to-heat meat options. For millennials, there is a greater willingness to prepare, but they are still leaning on convenient ready-made items and kits to a certain extent. Boomers, on the other hand, they're the most willing to prepare from scratch, but they're also not opposed to heat and eat options. Now, clashing directly with this, we also see the growth in exploration. And in the context of everyday meals, we're really seeing this as an expansion of our taste profiles and exploring new cuisines. In fact, 41% of Canadians say that they are preparing more multicultural inspired meals compared to last year. Now, of course, there are generational differences. Gen Z, for example, are leaning into Thai and Middle Eastern cuisines. Millennials are dabbling into Spanish. And boomers, maybe a little bit less adventurous as it relates to exploration. They're choosing cuisines like Italian and even other North American and Canadian dishes. So even within this context of cooking at home more often, there's this clash that's evident. Now, these tensions of old and new get even more interesting when we consider gender roles, especially as it relates to motherhood. And I know for the men in the room and the fathers, like, we know that you're pulling your weight, but I want to take a few minutes just to talk about the role of motherhood. Like it or not, trad wives are making noise, and this highly traditional persona is trending on a global scale. But let's just set aside politics and ideals for a minute and look at the actual share of stay-at-home moms. In Canada, they still represent a relatively small segment of the population, but it actually brings up a really important point in itself, in that when we talk about targeting mothers, there's so much clashing happening even between them. So let's take a moment just to compare two different types of motherhood. We are looking at working professional mothers on one hand, and our stay-at-home moms, or let's call them trad wives, just for argument's sake. When we look at nuanced differences between situational dynamics, activities while consuming, and even preparation dynamics, there are differences across the board. On one hand, working mothers really balance that social and solo dynamics. They're distracted and kind of have that jack of all trades, master of none kind of feeling. On the other hand, stay-at-home mothers there's more emphasis on communal dining, more mindful social connections, and they're much more intentional when it comes to multitasking. When it comes to meal preparation, on the one hand, it's really not surprising to see that working mothers are really leaning into leveraging convenient and solutions, where on the other hand, we see stay-at-home moms really leaning into scratch cooking and kind of honing those traditional skills in the kitchen. And then there's women like myself who kind of toe the line on both sides, which is kind of a weird hybrid beast in itself, where I'm presenting to you today, and my sourdough is fermenting on the counter. Now, of course, with the differences, there are also similarities. And if we look across motherhood, we see that we are both the primary shoppers and the meal preparers. And beyond that, there's also common denominators when it comes to our needs. We see things like family pleasing, nostalgia on both sides, sharing, of course, an energy boost, yes, but even extending into dietary intake and social impact. And so, of course, there's implications for marketers here in terms of understanding this full range of behaviors and requirements across each of the personas. And honestly, don't forget a good dose of empathy. These emerging and often polarizing personas are also no doubt linked to our insatiable use of technology, which is our next clashing trend. On one hand, we're peaking at a time of infinite access to information and rapidly evolving technology. And on the other hand, we're simultaneously clashing with this feeling of a trust deficit and growing information skepticism. We see contrasting signals everywhere, from high-tech adoption really expanding into older generations, as well as this retro revival among Gen Z, who honestly are trying to escape this constant barrage of connectivity. We're seeing things like flip phones come back and even Casios. So the role of technology as it relates to influencing our consumer health decisions, how we're sourcing our information, how we're preparing in the kitchen, and even our channel dynamics continues to evolve. And there are many clashes evident even within that. If we look overall, 20% or 28%, of Canadians report information sourced from tech-enabled tools and platforms are influencing our daily food and beverage choices. Now, these sources tend to be things like web searches, searching for online recipes, engaging in social media, apps, all the scanning, which millennials tend to really lean into. But on the contrary, we're also seeing that 58% of Canadians say they actually fear that technological progress is destroying our lives. And that's highest among our youngest generations. Further, only 35% say that they actually trust using AI. Now, I think AI has largely infiltrated more of our workplaces, and the technology is still somewhat new as it relates to how we're using it at home. although we are seeing some AI-powered smart kitchen assistants, for example, or personalized recipe recommendations. It'll be really interesting to see how this changes and evolves over the next few years. We also see, though, this clashing reliance on both technology and tradition as it relates to how we're sourcing our information. And I mean sourcing information as it relates to our health and food and beverage choices. On the tech side, we see growth of things like searching from knowledge websites, wearables, podcasts, and web searches. And on the other hand, we also see traditional sources growing, things like seeking advice from healthcare professionals, Canada's Food Guide, books and articles, and even mainstream media. But of course, below the surface, generations do interact quite differently with technology. Wearables, the growth of wearable technology is being driven by not only Gen Z, but also boomers. And when we look at both Gen Z and millennials, the #1 source of information is actually social media, which is so interesting because it's a channel that is ripe with conflicting information. Gen Z, though, tends to drive the growth of sourcing information from podcasts, whereas millennials are kind of leaning into seeking information from branded food and beverage websites. Of course, this has implications as it relates to connecting with consumers in the right space. We also see in our homes another contrast as it relates to traditional kitchen workhorses and leaning on new tech appliances. So we see this real juxtaposition of leaning on the familiar with also this desire for modern efficiencies. We see growth in appliances like the stove and oven and even the food processor. And honestly, when I saw that, I had to laugh because I have a food processor that sat in a box in my basement for the longest time, and now it's easily one of the most heavily used appliances I have. But at the same time, we're also seeing growth in new tech appliances. Things like the air fryer continues, slow cookers, Instapot, multi-cookers, this blending of appliances. And it's not really surprising to see that both Gen Z and millennials with kids are really leaning on this counter tech appliances. So this knowledge and understanding, of course, is key to really understand how are your targets working in the kitchen. And it also has implications as it relates to formats and innovative recipe development. On growing channel reliance on technology, it also further extends to our channel dynamics. Overall, consumers are really shifting away from conventional brick and mortar grocery stores and into other channels like discount grocery, Costco, and online. And that's really a reflection of finding the best deal. What's interesting, though, is this lean into online channels. It kind of happens to be a bit of a residual impact from the pandemic. That top blue line, the click and collect that really peaked kind of during the core of the pandemic, it still is holding pretty steady. So I think there's also a case to be made here as far as holding on to behaviors that really lend themselves to modern efficiencies. And in this case, obviously, technology playing a role. In our hyper-connected world, algorithms and mainstream media also push narratives into focus. And that brings us to our next trend. Of course, a prominent narrative in the mainstream media is that of climate change. Now, once the debate was on whether climate change was even occurring, and is now kind of weighing on the significant trade-offs in order to mitigate our impact on the planet. However, we're in a period of economic uncertainty, and so many of us are faced with this dilemma to make choices based on affordability and value. And that's where we see the say-do gap. Tensions are also evident as many consumers kind of feel like, yeah, I'm doing all that I can, while also feeling like, I think companies could be doing more. So we're shifting that accountability. Overall, though, we've entered a time of climate agreement in Canada, whereby 72% of the population agree that we are headed for environmental disaster without rapid change. Now, as that relates to consumption, factors relevant to product provenance are, by and large, driving the most of our decisions. By that, I mean concern for quality, safety, food safety rather, are naturally of utmost concern. These are table stake requirements. Now, generationally speaking, when we look at concerns for the environment and social, this tends to be weighing heavier for both Gen Z and millennial parents. But the bottom line is that we see growth across the board in terms of their influence on our decision to consume. We also see that over a quarter of Canadians, 28%, say, I am purchasing more food and beverage brands that demonstrate sustainable practices. And that number is at 45% among Gen Z. In addition to that, we see 40% say that they are willing to actually pay a premium for products that demonstrate these environmentally friendly practices. And that's up overall compared to last year. However, when we look at millennials, for example, while they're overdeveloped for increasing their purchase of sustainable brands, they're actually not quite as willing to fork out the extra cash for it compared to their counterparts, say like Gen Z. And I think this could be a likely reflection of who has more disposable income. And honestly, for myself, sometimes I really want to, but my kid needs a new pair of shoes. I think we can all agree that climate change is important, but what's interesting is that there's a clear disparity in terms of what some Canadians claim is important and then what they actually do as it relates to their consumption patterns. And by that, I mean the say-do gap. So let's take a minute to just kind of explore this a little bit further. If we look at among Canadians that say that they are strongly influenced by any one of these ESG related factors, and then we look at their actual consumption by way of label claims, we can see some pretty interesting differences. For millennial parents, they actually have a pretty low say-do gap. That means they're actually being true to their word. They're overdeveloped for label claims like compostable, grass-fed meats, fair trade, locally grown, farmed responsibly, premium, organic. You get the picture. On the other hand, though, among older consumers who say that they are strongly influenced by these claims, they actually have a pretty big say-do gap. They're underdeveloped on label claims like organic, free from antibiotics and hormones, fair trade, compostability, farmed responsibly. So in closing the say-do gap, it really requires a multi-pronged approach, and it's important for brands to really authentically align with initiatives that you can actually hang your hat on. And that's highlighting the benefits over greenwashing, for example. Remember, I talked about increasing consumer skepticism. It's really important to maintain consumer trust. But beyond labels, of course, we need to understand and take our needs into consideration. We are inherently still seeking to desire those core needs around like comfort, indulgence, convenience. We are all human after all. But what's also interesting, and it really shouldn't come as a surprise, to see that among those that are strongly influenced by ESG factors, some of the fastest growing needs really revolve around premium, natural, quality ingredients, things like tasty indulgence even, and balanced nutrition. But what are some of those foods then that are, and beverages that people are consuming? As far as relating to meeting premium and natural needs, it's really revolving around those perimeter store whole food categories. And as far as commercial beverages, we're seeing things like hot brewed coffee, flat waters, hot teas, and even pure juices. Now, that's not to say that there isn't kind of a role for indulgence or packaged goods, but I think what's important is that we get really clear on what's growing and as we look towards the future. Now, in addition to our rising concern for the environment, we also see this hyper focus on our health. And we're really desiring to adopt new behaviors to really eat well for our longevity. And that brings us to our next trend on health versus hedonism. On the health side, 82% of Canadians, both young and old, agree that of all the things that I can be doing to maintain good health, eating right is the most important. On the other hand, however, is this also that we see is this retreat to enjoyment, nostalgia, and comfort as a means of really satisfying these hedonistic pleasures, and quite frankly, probably combating a lot of these socioeconomic pressures that we're facing. So let's explore this in more detail. As it relates to our health, we are seeing some big numbers that we should pay attention to. 1 in 5 Canadians today report having a health-related condition, and the top reported conditions really revolve around weight concerns as well as stress. Now, focus on our intake patterns is also further underlined by some notable growth across many of our health-related drivers. Seeing double-digit growth in things like fewer, simpler ingredients, premium, quality ingredients, extending all the way down to fresh, less processed, pure, natural, made with real ingredients. I think the story is pretty clear. But as we know, it's holistic health that's the future. And by that, I mean really encompassing both the body and the mind as it relates to health. If we look at drivers overall, we see that mental health related drivers are actually growing at a faster rate than those that are physical functional ones. So when we have this conversation about health, we need to really focus on the fact that it's also balancing both the mental and emotional aspect as well as the physical functional. We're also seeing the mainstream emergence of GLP-1 agonists, and by that I mean the Ozempics of the world. In our latest CHATS omnibus study, we fielded a few questions related to this and found that 51% of Canadians say, yep, I've heard of one of these medications before. 8% of Canadians say, I actually am taking a GLP-1 related medication. Now, what are those key reasons for it? Primary reason, of course, is related to type 2 diabetes management, but also weight management. So why is this important? Well, there's no official, GLP-1 diet to follow per se, but there are now many evidence-based recommendations that are saying whole foods, whole grains, lean proteins, and low-fat dairy and alternatives. And foods to avoid, ultra-processed foods, foods and beverages without added sugars. So the bottom line is that this has potential big implications for not only indulgence categories, but snacking as well. In tandem with this, we're also seeing dietary regimes that are kind of linked to weight management to a certain extent. Overall, 20% of Canadians say I follow a specific dietary regime. And we've kind of seen this ebb and flow over the last few years as far as, the order and the prioritization of what these specific diets are. At the moment, we see gluten-free rising to the top and growing. But what we're paying attention to are things like calorie-reduced diets and intermittent fasting. Now, intermittent fasting has pulled back overall compared to last year, but when we look at generationally speaking, it is big growth among Gen Z. Now, launching off our hunger for cleaner and simpler ingredients, our Canadian market has really acted with force, and we have seen explosive innovation in the better for you space. And by that, we see really supporting that increased desire for function. Overall, 45% of foods and commercial beverages consumed are being driven by a nutritional and metabolic driver, and that's up 18% compared to 2023. We see factors being driven like mood support, weight control, gut health, vitamin deficiency, supporting immunity. Now, it's been really interesting to also see this added complexity. We're seeing a lot of blurring of category lines, and that's especially related to functional beverages. There's a lot of new brands that have become mainstream, things like Sapsucker, Wake Water, and pre and probiotic sodas like Cove and Poppy, for example. And even internally, we're having our own debates as far as which category do these beverages even fit in, and how are consumers interacting with them? Now, adding to the pressure, of course, for certain categories will be the front of package legislation that's going to come into play over the next year. We've been tracking this for a few years and found that 68% of individuals report that these front of pack symbols will influence their purchase decision. Now that's up almost 1.5 points compared to 2023. So of course, time will tell to see if this is actually true and how the nuanced differences will play out depending on the category. As it relates to how we're interacting with nutrition facts table, by and large, calories kind of remains that top spot. It's been really interesting to see this trading places of both sugar and sodium over the long term, and sugar now is inching closer and closer to closing that gap on calories. But what's really interesting that we've been tracking is the growth of protein over the long term, and it now holds a really solid number 4 spot. While much of this better for you space really focuses on the added benefits, we're also watching another trend. Focus on our intake patterns is really being reflected also in this trend towards moderation. So if we look at alcohol consumption, for example, we see that average monthly servings and occasions are down across all drinkers, and that's being primarily driven by those under the age of 34. The monthly penetration of non-alcoholic beer, the largest of the non-alcoholic category, however, has also experienced 20% growth every single year in the past 3 years. Now myself, I am a craft beer enthusiast, and I can definitely attest to following some of these trends, but it's been so interesting to see some of our local establishments kind of grab hold and pivot with these trends. Our favorite local brewery, Town Brewery, which is we're in Whitby, they've even established this core lineup of non-alcoholic beverages, some of which I actually have in my fridge today. We've obviously spent a lot of time talking about health, but what about hedonism? Canadians mainly desire to button down our health priorities, but we're also contrasting this with this desire to seek enjoyment and comfort and just let go and really relax and enjoy the moment. We're seeing growth across a multitude of experiential needs, things like nostalgia, enhancing the moment, comfort, good serving with guests, and even decadence and indulgence. Comfort, though, by and large, remains the largest across the board, but it's the younger generations that are driving this growth in nostalgia and kind of seeking more moments of joy. So what kind of foods are we talking about? Well, for millennials with kids, in terms of satisfying nostalgic requirements, we're looking at snack and lunch kits. We're looking at frozen snacks and appetizers, nachos, meat snacks, tortilla chips, and even candy, many of which are actually quite indulgent by nature. But our tastes and preferences for indulgence have actually somewhat shifted, and I think that could be largely tied to our changing demography as well. If we look overall at kind of the flavor preferences, we see that by and large, we're still satisfying our collective sweet tooth. at 67%. But over the last few years since the pre-pandemic periods, we've seen this shift into more salty, savory categories and flavors. Now, these taste preferences tend to be much stronger among newcomers, as well as both Afro-Caribbean and Middle Eastern Canadians. So it's really important that we keep our eye on the shifting indulgence requirements and categories that really satisfy these hedonistic pleasures, while also keeping in mind this better for you requirement. Of course, many of these shifting patterns across our diverse country remind us of the need to stay on top of some of the broader population trends. And so we're going to circle back to the big picture to remind ourselves that these macro forces at play are actually happening amidst broader population changes. But even within our population shifts, there are clashing themes within them, and they're multifaceted and require further understanding. On one hand, we see the continued growth of a youthful multicultural population, while on the other hand, our population is aging and they have their own unique requirements. To add to this clash, we also see this coinciding economic pressures and income wealth disparity that's happening to affect across all generations. But let's first just talk about the obvious in terms of our population shifts. With a target of reaching 44 million Canadians by 2030, we are way closer to hitting that number than not. In fact, we're almost at 42 million currently. Now, reports of millennials overtaking boomers was once a near future inflection point, but that's already happened, and millennials are now among the dominant generations in the country. Of course, aging is a factor in the decline of boomers, but they still account for a significant share of our population and our wealth. But most of our older adults actually feel that they're undervalued and that they're valuing people under 50 more than over 50. So I think this is a good reminder to also keep in mind the mature consumer market and understand their unique needs. In contrast with this, of course, we see the rise of millennials largely being attributed to our record numbers of new Canadians. But only 52% of Canadians agree that immigration has a positive impact on society. So we've reached this inflection point where both the young and older generations really hold our attention. And so it's important to continue to understand the unique differences across them. So let's take a couple minutes here to just quickly contrast some of the unique differences between our younger generations, our Gen Z and millennials, for example, in contrast with our older generations, our Gen X and boomers. And of course, some of these may be obvious, but some also have some interesting nuanced differences. Prevalence of multicultural consumers and new Canadians weighs heavier among our younger Canadians, whereas our older Canadians tend to be less diverse. Younger generations tend to span over multiple life stages, whereas our older consumers tend to be kind of more focused in one specific life stage. As it relates to our consumption, younger generations tend to have lower overall per capita consumption rates, but they have a much broader competitive set. Among our older generations, they actually have higher per capita consumption rates, but have a much smaller competitive set. As it relates to our diets, we have mini-mealers adhering to many more alternative types of diets, where older generations tend to be three-square traditionalists. And of course, we have differences in our needs. Younger generations are overdeveloped for things like social confidence, exploration, nostalgia, social impact. These are all needs that we've been talking about today. And on the other hand, our older generations lean into comfort, convenience, they're brand loyalists, and are overdeveloped for premium products. So of course, this has implications on both sides. For our younger generations, there's plenty of room for innovation and new categories, where among our older generations, maybe it requires more of a focused approach on traditional categories and on volume and legacy products. But woven through these polarizing demographic characteristics is this additional clash of our wealth disparity. 75% of Canadians agree that these large income disparities are widely recognized as detrimental to society. And 72% of Canadians say that the economy is rigged to advantage the rich and powerful. Now, of course, the intensity of these feelings kind of has a trickle-down effect as it relates to our consumption habits. But recent numbers tell us that fewer consumers are actually experiencing sticker shock. And we have somewhat come to terms with our rising prices. And yet, at the same time, we've hit record numbers visiting Canada's food banks. And now almost a quarter of Canadians live in food insecure households. Let that sink in for a minute. Those are big numbers. This, of course, underlines the importance of value. Now, in 5, what we capture is the value trigger, and it's comprised of 2 key components. we have wanting to save money, and something that's good value for money. And this is as it relates to consumption, not purchase. Overall, over a third of all food and commercial beverage occasions are driven by the value trigger. Now that's pulled down since last year, but I just hold that thought because I'm going to go talk about that in a minute. As it relates to both our meal and snacking occasions, there's differences here too. The value trigger tends to weigh a bit heavier on meals, especially at dinner, but it's still driving over a quarter of all snack occasions. Now, if we look at it from a household income level perspective, for example, we see that both lower to middle income earning households, the value trigger is actually growing in relevance and importance. Whereas among higher income earning households, it's actually pulled back or is less relevant. So again, we're just widening the gap. But what does value really mean? In terms of good value for money, we're talking about a brand preference. We're talking about pack or format requirements. It's something that's premium with quality ingredients or healthy and nutritious. On the wanting to save money side, it's really all about word of mouth and recommendations from others. It's about reining in our waste. It's about trying something new and different. And I think in this context, it could be shifting into control or private label brands in an effort to save money. And it also extends into kind of gap fill. Now, we've talked a lot about these clashing trends today, but how does this play out overall as it relates to our actual consumption? If we look at our annual servings per capita, we're actually down overall, despite this growth in our population. We're down 10% compared to 2016, and we're down again 1% compared to 2023. Now, if we look at these simplification factors, of course, it's being driven by factors like inflation and food prices. I've seen other statistics thrown around like parents cutting back on their own intake in order to feed their children. But we also see cultural and societal factors, changing and shifting dietary habits and regimes. Remember talking about the pulling back on calorie cutting, as well as other things like intermittent fasting. We're also pulling back on our waste concerns. These declines are pretty consistent though with what we've seen in the last year, and that they're most notable among Gen Z and millennial consumers. We have spent a lot of time so far talking about the trends, of course, but in the 11th edition of our CHATS report, we go beyond the trends and we talk about our day part consumption. And so, of course, it's important to ask, how do our trends impact across the day parts? So in the time that we have left, I just want to talk through a bit of the highlights, both at dinner and at snacking before we wrap up. But before we do, let's just quickly look at kind of the overall picture of what's happening with our day parts consumption. Now, overall, we're largely holding on to our consumption dynamics, but remember, this is within a shrinking pie. And in 5, we can look at our kind of food and meal and snacking occasions in 2 different ways. We can look at it in terms of a sheer size of occasions or the number of events that happen throughout the day. And in this case, we see a bit of a pullback in snacking and as a benefit into meal occasions. And that's really a reflection of the pullback during evening snack occasions. Now, on the other hand, we can look at it in terms of a share of servings. In this case, we often see the share of meals much higher because of our complex kind of dynamics at meals. There's more items being included in a meal occasion. But by and large, our consumption patterns are pretty flat. We can also look at it in terms of per capita consumption rates, which we go into much more detail in the report. And here's where we can see nuanced differences and a bit of shifts and changes, not only from a cultural perspective, but also from a generational perspective. Dinner. Of course, dinner is an important meal that many Canadians kind of come together at the end of the day. Dinner is also increasingly being prepared at home. Now, again, there are nuanced differences when we look at generations or cultural differences. Younger Canadians tend to lean into more food service and HMR channels. Scratch cooking is also in, but so are the modern efficiencies, especially as it relates to appliance usage. We talked about this earlier as a way of mitigating these price pressures. We're leaning into kind of honing our traditional skills in the kitchen, but we also need these modern efficiencies as it relates to some of those countertop appliances. In terms of what we're prioritizing, it's really around Canadian made, freshness, natural, organic. Again, remember the value triggers prioritize at dinner. This is a nice reflection of how that value for money kind of comes to life. As far as what we're eating, our main dish items by and large still stay the same. We're really kind of focusing in our meat proteins as the top ranking foods, but even within that, we see a bit of change. We're seeing kind of cheaper cuts of meat, things like pork growing at a faster rate. But at the same time, we're also seeing vegetables as a main dish and even ethnic dishes growing. And it's honestly not surprising to see that, given our desire and need for this expansion and kind of dabbling into different cuisines. Overall, from a need standpoint at dinner, Canadians are really seeking this clean comfort foods and those have on hand solutions, and of course that offer good value for money. Now, snacking on the other hand, we've seen a lot of change happening, but don't worry, snacking is not going anywhere. Snacking definitely remains an ingrained behavior in our diets, and the per capita rates by and large are staying the same. Of course, we do see some nuanced differences across the generations, but by and large, it's still holding steady. What we do see though is when we look at the snacking day part, so morning, afternoon, and evening, we are actually still seeing a bit of a contraction towards the midday, so our afternoon snack occasions. And this is kind of shedding light on the opportunity for so many occasions within that. We see a range of targets and we see a range of motivations and foods all kind of clashing at this time of day. We're also consuming at home more often when it comes to snacking. Something to keep your eye on is the fact that commercial beverages are actually increasingly being left out of snacking occasions. But tap water, on the other hand, is up. And there are some cultural differences there that are driving this change. When it comes to our consideration set, we see that non-traditional snack foods, by and large, are still holding steady. We've seen kind of a real growth in that since the pandemic periods, and we're holding on to that. And by non-traditional snack foods, I mean like I'm having a sandwich for a snack, I'm having a slice of pizza, or a bowl of ready-to-eat cereal. And I think that's a real reflection of the fact that we're home a lot more often. I have a lot more at my disposal than I do if I'm just at the office. And so it's important to consider, you know, your own traditional competitive set and now that expansion for consumers. And of course, at the end of the day, as we talked about a lot earlier, is the fact that functionality is in. We're seeing this increased desire for nutritional and metabolic needs, and this is a reflection too in our snacking categories as well. On the other hand, though, we're also seeking indulgence, but there's a lean into better for you. There's a lean into reducing that guilt. So today we have shared just a mere glimpse of the complexity that really stems from this clashing of multiple factors or trends being true. And as I said, it's really not that either side is right or wrong, but it just unveils this multi-level opportunities for alignment. What's important though is that we step back and we see the forest for the trees, as many of us can get very focused on those day-to-day brands and categories that we live and breathe. But by helping you to understand these current trends, we're really uncovering insights that allow for this proactive adjustments for long-term success. But remember, there is no one clear and direct path towards success, because ultimately choosing a path is up to you, or you can forge your own. Thank you so much, everyone. Now I'm just going to see here, we have a couple minutes left as the questions come in. And I think we'll have time for one question, maybe Ellen, and then we'll wrap things up. I see here one that talks about, you mentioned earlier that GLP-1s are being taken by about 8% of the population. Are there any generational nuances? This is actually a really great question. And when I look at the data, it's actually really fascinating. We see that overall, Gen Z actually has the highest reported rates of taking the medication, which to me, I was a bit taken aback by that because I definitely thought it would be kind of weighing much heavier into the boomer generation. And it's also interesting to see that the reasons for taking it are actually leaning more into the weight management side of things than it is on the, type 2 diabetes, which I know they're kind of linked to a certain extent. But as far as the actual kind of prioritization of reason for taking it was really interesting. And I think ultimately, at the end of the day, it's really a reflection of paying attention to the fact that these are also consumers that are heavy snackers. And so, what are the implications as we roll out to the future and, see if this will become more mainstream, for example. And so it's something that we're definitely going to keep tracking in 5. All right, Ellen, I think we're pretty much at time here, so I will throw it back over to you to close things out.
Well, that's wonderful. Jenny, I just really want to thank you for your deep dive into today's presentation. And thank you everyone for sticking with us. There are questions, and because we've run out of time, those questions will be answered directly by email. Also, in the coming days, you will receive an email with a direct link to today's recorded presentation. It will take us a couple of days to get that up there. But in the meantime, do check out our handout section in the webinar control panel for more about the research we shared today. Of course, Jenny's email address is up there on screen, so please feel free to reach out directly with any questions you may have. That now concludes today's amazing webinar. Have a wonderful day, everyone.